See, my notes start blowing everywhere. You may get to see how fast I can run. We are here today to discuss the Washington and Rochambeau National Historic Trail and the unveiling of a marker. Vice Mayor Vic. Hello.
Hi.
By the way, the Vice Mayor of Newport News, Tina Vick, thank you. Sorry, but
Don't worry.
good to see you.
Thanks.
Thank you for supporting us. The City of Newport News has great historic sites, museums, and we are quite pleased to be able to work in education and with other museum systems. But I think it is important to realize the American Revolution is where our freedom was won, and we would not have that freedom without the contribution of the French. I was today with Cheryl and others of you at the Yorktown Day celebration, and I had the honor of being the keynote speaker, and in 12 minutes I had to sum this up, so I promise I won't take very long either. But I cannot stress enough that the September 28th through October 19th, 1781 siege of Yorktown by the forces of General George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and Lieutenant General le Comte de Rochambeau, Jean-Baptiste d'Antien de Vermeer, le Comte de Rochambeau. Close enough. Close enough for a Virginian. It's not too bad. So, French mom, somewhat pleased. But do you have a gentleman that is a 40-year combat veteran? We admire Washington for the ability to keep the Continental Army together throughout adversity at Valley Forge and even worse winters that they suffered in 1780. He had courage. He was large and in charge on the battlefield and had physical courage in the Battle of Princeton, riding between the lines. Now, it's one thing to stand up and give a speech amongst friends, but to ride in between the lines with bullets going through your cloak, trying to keep your men from running, and they would have been slaughtered had they did that. That's physical courage, and he was 6'2". So he's always a tall man. However, Rochambeau is a part of that combined operation, was a 40-year veteran of the French Army. And he brought to the table an understanding of siege engineering, artillery, and military planning and execution. The Earl Charles Cornwallis was an honorable opponent. He had been in the Carolinas in the Southern campaign of the American Revolution since 1778, fought throughout the Carolinas. After Guilford Courthouse, they come into Virginia in May of 1781, and on August 2nd, 1781, Lord Cornwallis and 7,700 British, Hessian, and Loyalist troops end up at both Yorktown and Gloucester Point. And they begin entrenching. They're waiting for resupply from Sir Henry Clinton up in New York, and he's supposed to bring them more troops. Rochambeau arrived in Newport, Rhode Island on July 10th, 1780, with over 5,000 French soldiers. By the summer of 1781, Washington and Rochambeau were looking for a way to work together in conjunction with one of the most important partners of that was Admiral le Comte deGrasse, with the entire French West Indies fleet of 24 ships of the line. How many of you remember the Admiral coming in to Yorktown? It was a frigate. You know how small it made the Jamestown ships look? If the Comte de Grasse's flagship, 110-gun ship of the line, the Ville de Paris, was right by the Admiral, it would have made it look small too. These are basically battleships or dreadnoughts of our time period. De Grasse was down in the Caribbean protecting their vital sugar islands and was coming up to the Chesapeake Capes. And Washington and Rochambeau saw an opportunity. Now this, in history textbooks, many of you teach history, that sounds like a great idea. But think about this, for the mothers in the group. You're moving 7,000 soldiers over 400 miles from Morristown, New Jersey to Yorktown in the heat of August, wearing wool uniforms, and you can't have Hot Pockets and pizza. You have to bring your food with you on hooves. So they're moving everything down here, and Rochambeau and Washington arrive in September the 14th, 1781. Now, more importantly, before that time period, on August 30th, 1781, without them knowing it, they did not know if he would arrive, Admiral deGrasse arrives off of the Chesapeake Capes. Okay, Charles is over on the eastern shore, Cape Henry's in now Virginia Beach, and he arrives with 24 ships of the line. Imagine moving 7,000 people from New York down to Williamsburg and moving an entire French fleet with 3,300 soldiers on board those ships, who I'm sure never had seasickness, and they came all the way up to the Chesapeake Capes. No one had a cell phone, GPS, or weather channel. And they all came together. It was perfect timing if you were on the Allied side. But that's the only one we care about today. So, we are here. And then, of course, once they arrive, when they arrive outside the Chesapeake Capes, deGrasse immediately knew that the British were out in the ocean and were coming this way. He disembarked on September 1st, 1781, Claude de Rouvet, Le Marquis de Saint-Simon's 3,300 soldiers and 9 cannons. Now, if any of you have ever served in the armed forces, these are not motor boats. How are they powered? With sail and by... You're basically at the Lynnhaven-Lessner Bridge, where Croker's restaurant is. And you've just disembarked 3,300 soldiers into whatever bateaus or whatever you can get. They have to sail into the Chesapeake Bay, make a left turn where Fort Monroe would be today at Old Point Comfort, sail all the way by Newport News Shipyard, which wasn't there at Newport News Point, come right past the Crab Shack, the Mariners Museum, and somewhere right out there. How many of you have ever sailed on the James River, other than myself? What can happen on a fine summer September afternoon right out here? A thunderstorm. Now, you're a French soldier. You're wearing a linen uniform because you were in the colonies. You were down in the Caribbean. And you're a long way from home, and you're up here with Saint-Simon, and you're out in the James River, the same river that John Smith took to go to Jamestown. And you're fighting for our independence. And you're out there, and all of a sudden someone turns on the spigot, and you're soaking wet. It's thundering. And there's boats with cannons, and one of the local pilots sees the entrance to Deep Creek. They are rowing and sailing as fast as they can get in here, and right above them had been established in 1680 our county seat, Warwicktown. Warwicktown was here. There was a jail, there was a courthouse, there was a tobacco inspector. That'd be a great office to run for. And great office, honorary, just saying. And work on it, Tina, right? So, you know. So, and you figure that you come past this settlement and you are soaking wet and you land right here. You land right here. They build bonfires. Your ammunition's already wet. And the next day, you've dried off, you get on a boat, and you go right back to Jamestown Island where you were supposed to go to meet the Marquis de Lafayette and a small Continental and Virginia militia force that's desperately trying to hold Cornwallis from escaping until Washington and Rochambeau can come down. And they did not have this map. Had Cornwallis had this, which Cheryl provided, history might have changed a tad bit because we know what happened and we have better maps. So, I love maps. But anyway, so they moved down to, they all arrive at the same time. Saint-Simon and Lafayette are there on September 14th, 1781 in Williamsburg to meet Washington and Rochambeau. There was a more important player they had to see, and that was Admiral deGrasse. So Washington and Rochambeau on the captured British corvette Queen Charlotte sailed out to Lynnhaven, and imagine a little pomp and circumstance is great, especially when we get everybody's names right. And they arrive, the bosun whistles blowing. Washington and Rochambeau arrive on deGrasse's flagship. Now think about Washington. He's 6'2". Guess how tall deGrasse is? 6'4". And they said on days of battle he's 6'5". So they meet him. Now he's already on September 5th already defeated, or he's already defeated the Royal Navy under Rear Admiral Thomas Graves. So he's already defeated 19 ships of the line on September 5th, 1781. So this is now mid-September. So he's feeling pretty good about himself. The French Navy's bested the Royal Navy, and Washington and Rochambeau's on his quarterdeck. And think of your entire life, you're always the tallest man around. And you walk on this impressive, scary warship that you're not going to win without him, and there's deGrasse staring at you, and you're like, whoops. So deGrasse, being a good French count, comes marching over to him and embraces Washington and says, "Bonjour, mon petit général." So, a little icebreaker there to get everyone feeling good. And they meet and they make a plan that changes not only our history, but French history and world history. They come up with the idea that while they blockade the Capes, Washington and Rochambeau's army will march from Williamsburg on September 28, 1781, and they will lay siege to the British in Yorktown. The French convoys that will be coming from here will go past on the James River, go up to College Creek, bringing food, ammunition, and supplies. They will go into Williamsburg, and there's a continued train of supplies coming to Yorktown. It's not just the combat soldiers, it's the quartermasters, the food, and other things. And where I work at Enview Plantation, the Harwood family provided beef, mutton, hay, fodder, and other things to the Continental Army and to the French to help supply the Allied Army. Of course, they wanted to be paid later. That's why we found out about that. So Cornwallis is facing a bad predicament, and he's not going to receive the reinforcements from Sir Henry Clinton that he's supposed to. The British and French begin to dig closer and closer. The first parallel goes up with 52 siege guns. Then they put in the second siege line. They begin to pummel it. On the night of October 14th, 1781, the first real successful combined operation in U.S. Armed Forces history happens when Vicomte de Dupont, with 2 French regiments, will take Redoubt number 9 in 30 minutes. They have unloaded muskets, because if you're sneaking out across the battlefield at night to seize those earthworks, you have to be quiet, and they're using the pointed bayonet. So they charge in saying, "Long live the King," in French, and they take it. Now, I'm not going to start dancing and singing, but Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who more young people know about him than ever have. But Alexander Hamilton begs and begs Washington to lead the attack, and he will lead the attack, and they take Redoubt number 10 in 10 minutes. He is carrying a pistol and a sword. His men are behind him. They go completely around Redoubt 10, and as the Scottish major of the 71st Highlander is sneaking out the back, there he stands with him with a French dragoon pistol that looked like Dirty Harry's revolver, and he pulls the hammer back, which makes a large noise at night, and said, "I have you, sir." And the British officer said, "By God, sir, you do." They didn't really mess around with language back then. Cornwallis did not have Jim Cantori to tell him on the night of October 16th it was not a good idea to try to escape to Gloucester Point. And a tempest blew up that scattered his ships around. On October 17th, they sought terms of surrender. They showed up with this. And they went to the Moore House on October 18th. And one of the greatest things in American education is the British sent Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dundas and Major Alexander Ross, and the French had the Vicomte de Noailles, I believe was Lafayette's brother-in-law, and they had Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence. Guess who was the only person in the room that could speak both French and English? The American, Colonel Lawrence. So we had a good advantage because we knew what both sides were saying. That was helpful. And then on October 19th, 7,247 British, Hessian, and other soldiers were surrendered to the Allied Army. Your ancestor was there waiting because Cornwallis was not feeling well that day. He was not accorded the honors of war because of some of the treatment toward the Americans at Charleston. So they were not allowed to come out with their flags flying, playing a American or French tune, and he was not given the honors of war. His men were turned into prisoners of war. They were not paroled and sent home. He and his other officers were allowed to go home. So as they come up, the British knew that who had won that victory? It was French cannons. It was French engineers. They provided 90% of our gunpowder during the Revolutionary War and most of the training. So they tried to give the sword, which is not the real one, but they tried to give the sword to Rochambeau. And Rochambeau, without even speaking, pointed toward Washington, and Washington thought, that is not Cornwallis, that is his second in command, so you can surrender to my second in command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who had been the Continental officer in May of 1780 that had to surrender Charleston without honors. So can you imagine, you were there at Saratoga, which that's a good one day, that's a good day for us. Then it's a bad day at Charleston, but what's sweeter than sweet is karma's beautiful. And he's like, remember me? I'm back. And it's all mine. And he had the sword. So they were able to surrender. And it is important that we remember these folks, and that we remember, as I said, Emma Chenoweth and the ladies of the Comme de Grace chapter of the DAR considered that Admiral deGrasse was one of the forgotten French heroes of the American Revolution. We have not forgotten Rochambeau's role. No. Rochambeau, he cannot stress his role enough, that he provided, and what's unique about his partnership with Washington is that he said that I have come here to serve, not command. A man of 40 years of combat experience, one of King Louis XVI's most trusted soldiers, who had helped rebuild the French army after the 7 Years' War, and he comes to America and works with Washington, and that's how things are done. When you form a unity of effort and a unity of command, that's what happens. And it won our independence. And we're here today because we want to unveil a marker that means a great deal to many of us, because the Marquis de Saint-Simon is a very forgotten French hero. He was there to provide reinforcement and some sound judgment to Lafayette and others, that when he arrived at Jamestown Island, and to be able to provide crucial reinforcements so Cornwallis would not escape until the main Allied army came down. It is important to us to be part of the Washington-Rochambeau Trail because the City of Newport News values our history, and we value the part that it's something that's marketable, it's something that you can educate folks with, and we like being a part of that. And we appreciate those of you on council and others that share those values with us. So, without further ado, I would like to ask our elected officials, all of you please,